typically the concept of scope of practice is something that is used to refer to licensed professionals, because what the scope is referring to is the sort of range of services that they are licensed to provide under the license given to them by the state. So when you think about who has a scope of practice, it's licensed doctors, licensed midwives, licensed nurses to some extent, although nurses aren't actually providers or supporting providers. Lawyers have a scope of practice because we are licensed, but other kinds of non-licensed professionals do not talk about their job description in terms of scope of practice. Your viewer might wonder, well, what's wrong with the language of scope? Why shouldn't we use the language of scope? And I guess the reason that I would encourage doulas to rethink the sort of cultural path that the profession of doulaism has gone down, and the way that the language of scope has become almost ubiquitously adopted by doula organizations, is that, again, scope of practice is a really particular term that's used to refer to licensed providers. Right? Once the doulas who are in the maternity care, the L&D room, whatever it is, start talking about themselves of having a scope of practice, they have now firmly situated themselves with the providers instead of with the woman. Instead of a citizen who was with this woman. No, I'm not her sister. No, I'm not her mother. But I am going to be with her through this birth. With her, at her side, like the mother that really knows a lot of stuff. Yeah. You know what I mean? Yeah. And has so what if you were to talk about that person in terms of a scope of practice, it would be ridiculous. And so, and so then really what we're talking about here, I mean, really the concern around scope of practice is, should doulas be licensed professionals? Because if we really believe that they should be, then go ahead and use scope until you're licensed. Yeah. And then you could say, well, we're not recognized as having a license yet, we're not regulated, but we should be, and so therefore we're going to start to define ourselves that way until the law catches up and regulates us. But then, to me, the idea of doulas being licensed and regulated is extremely problematic, because what we're talking about here is sort of women's ownership of their reproductive health, people's ownership of their reproductive health, and the ability to have somebody with you who is there for you. And so and really it's like, what should define whether that person's able to be there for me? I should. Yeah. And once, so what would be the state's role in overseeing what my doula can and can't do? What is the purpose of that? What is the purpose of that? The only purpose of that could possibly be to reassure the healthcare providers in the hospital that are worried about doulas, that doulas aren't doing what they don't want doulas to do, which is being too mouthy, stepping on their the providers' toes. It's for the providers, and again, once you're in that space, whether you're in an individual birth or you're like looking from a macro perspective on what is a doula and should doulas be regulated in my state, once you're in the space of your focus of your concern is on those who have power, namely the hospitals and the providers with the power to kick you out of the room, you are no longer aligned with the woman. And so there's two types of conversations. So again, circling back to this issue of advice, when can a doula give advice? and one of the things you just said was that doulas are clear that they have the ability to share information, and that this is foundational to the doula work. Yes. And at the same time that there's controversy and discussion within the doula community about when does the sharing of information become advice? And in a way, like one way that we can separate that out is the way that I try to separate it out for providers around informed consent and try to help them to think through what the process is supposed to look like. And the way that I tell providers informed consent is supposed to work, because what informed consent is supposed to mean that the provider, which of course is not a doula, tells the patient or the client what the provider perceives their clinical condition to be, and then what the treatment alternatives for this condition are, including the option of doing nothing, and then the risks and benefits of each of those options, and then supporting the client in making the decision that is best for them, which is going to be a factor not only of these clinical factors and what the doctor can see, but of many other factors that influence how they weigh the risks and benefits of their options. And so the way that I tell providers they should be communicating in this process is that it's a three-pronged process: inform, advise, support. So the inform is objective and the advise is subjective.
Okay.
And if they break it out like that, and this is something that you could bring to the providers as a doula, you know, if they, it's just a mental tool they can give themselves to sort out what is objective and what is subjective. But because the information must be delivered in a way that is thorough and in a way that is unbiased. And doctors, OBs, you know, nurses and midwives themselves will acknowledge that one of what they perceive to be a major shortfall in informed consent refusal, to some extent, you know, OBs are, maternal health community is waking up to the fact that there's a big informed consent problem in maternity care, but they're not quite ready to focus on force and abuse. The cases that they're willing to talk about at this point are the way that information is usually shaped in the delivery to get to what the doctor or the provider wants this person to choose. And so a solution to that is, you know, inform, objective, thorough, all the information. And then if you have advice as the provider, which you don't have to, it's enough just to inform and support, but if you have advice, you can give your subjective advice in sort of prong 2. And then prong 3 is support, and that means through conversation, whatever conversation it takes, support that person in making their best choice. And that means, it means you don't just say, sign, what do you want to do, sign here, take it or leave it, but you have a conversation and ultimately recognize them as having the ability, the right to make the decision, and then supporting them in what the healthcare decision that they make, rather than abandoning them or withdrawing care if they don't choose what you want them to choose. So that's the providers. We wish that would happen. It would be a transfer. Maybe doulas wouldn't be as needed. But in the meantime, it's like when doulas are sharing the information, so they're watching that dynamic where the provider may be either in a prenatal conversation about, say, VBAC versus planned cesarean, those kinds of choices, or induction or whatever, or during labor, is giving the woman information in a way that is not thorough. You know, they haven't talked about the long-term risks of the C-section to the next pregnancy. You know, they haven't said, how many kids are you planning on having? And so this woman is not in a position to make an informed decision. And so, I mean, doulas accept that sharing information is something that the woman has hired them to do a lot of the time. And so then the question is, can they tell the woman what they think she should do? So if we agree, they can absolutely share information. They can give her all the books on her shelf. And then if she says, Nikki, what do you think I should do? Does Nikki have to say, I'm sorry, Hermine, I'm not allowed to tell you what I think. That would be outside my scope of practice. I don't think that Nikki has to say that. And if I was Nikki's client, I would now feel a divide. Suddenly, you're putting your concept of what your professionalism over answering a simple question that I asked you, which is, what do you think I should do? And so, I think the first time I saw this issue come up was a big Facebook controversy over, like an example, you've probably heard many of these kinds of stories, of a doula who had, I think the woman's doctor told her to induce. And her doula said, you know, maybe let's take, for the sake of the hypo, let's agree that the doula told her not to induce, and that she chose to follow her doula's advice, and that the baby was born, and then the baby spent time in the NICU. And afterwards, she blamed her doula. She said, I'm thinking I should have induced, and it's my doula's fault. And then this goes out into the community, and all the doulas circulated it, and they seemed to agree across the board that this doula was so bad, so wrong, should lose her whatever they have to lose, and should be in big trouble. And I read that, and it's just like, what are we saying here? What are we assuming? We're assuming that this woman is not capable of making an independent, informed decision on the basis of all of the advice that she might get from everybody in her life, but that somebody's going to make the decision for her, and that if it's not the doctor, it's the doula, Right. And so underneath this, there's this like misogynistic cultural assumption that women don't make choices, that somebody makes choices for them. And so that you see that in the context of home birth all the time, when home birth midwives are attacked for supporting a woman's choice to give birth outside the hospital, and the narrative is that the home birth midwife led her into it, misled her into it, encouraged her, and there's sort of this Pied Piper. I've seen it over and over. This Pied Piper model of the midwife that's asserted by the legal system, as if she's tootling out of the door and all of these dumb women are following her out of there. And so, you know, I think we can think about this whole idea of can the doula give advice back in the context of informed consent and refusal. Because informed consent and refusal, the whole idea of it is that only the patient, only the client is in a position to assess all the information and all of the factors and make a decision, and that they have the right to do that.
Yeah.
So if I'm a client and I hire you as my doula, and I go to a doctor, I go to a midwife, I go to whatever, I go to an acupuncturist, I go to my hairdresser, you know, and I go to my butcher, and I ask them all, do you think I should induce? You know, I believe they are all free to tell me what they think that I should do. And in fact, they are.
Yeah.
And then it is my responsibility legally, because I have the right to make that decision, it's my responsibility to integrate all that information. I know who each of those people are. I know you're my doula. I know that's my doctor. If I believe that my doula is actually giving me more accurate information than my doctor, and ultimately I think this set of information that we've looked at together is more accurate than this set of information, and that in light of everything, this is what I'm going to do, I'm responsible. Just like with a home birth midwife. If I choose to have my breech baby outside the hospital because what they're offering me in the hospital for breech delivery is so abusive that I will not go in for that, then I give birth outside the hospital and my baby doesn't breathe after it passes through the pelvis, which might happen because breech birth is riskier in all settings, I cannot. I believe it is ethically wrong, and it is legally wrong under the principle of informed consent and refusal for me to turn around and say, she should not have allowed me to do that. Because it is not her job to allow me or not allow me to do anything.
Thank you.
It's her job to support me in making my healthcare decisions and to not abandon me. It's the obligation of the entire healthcare system to not abandon me in my choices. So if anybody doesn't like my choices, their only legitimate question is, how can I support that choice to make it more safe? If they think it's a dangerous choice to have my breech baby at home, then have an ambulance in the street.
Yeah.
Don't try to drag me into that ambulance.
Right.
That's violating my human rights.
Wow, thank you. And then adding to that, right, for the doula, and thinking in terms of, well, wait, I've never heard this before. I can give advice. I can say, I think you should, or I think you shouldn't. We have to check ourselves, and we have to understand where our advice is coming from. And I think that's the key.
And what's your role?
And what's your role, right? So I tell myself over and over and over again when I'm working with clients, it's not my body, not my baby, not my birth.
Right.
What I might choose for myself may not be right for this person.
Correct.
So I'm not going to say, well, you know, when I had Violet,
Right.
I did X, Y, and Z. So, you know, transitive theory says you should do it too.
Yes.
You are an individual.
Right.
What do you need from me? What kind of support and what information do you need from me? And if you really want to know what I think you should do, I want to know about how you're feeling.
Yes.
I want to know, what if you did? What if you didn't? How would that feel for you? And let's go deeper. Where's that coming from? What's your history? What's informing you in the intersections of all your identities and your experiences in your life? What is telling you, I'm not feeling so good about this, or I'm feeling pretty good about this, and let's work together. And in that's kind of how I give advice. And yeah, sometimes I do advise, you know, on both sides.
And what you're doing is informing and supporting.
Right.
Which is actually the most appropriate thing that a doula can do. Inform and support. She doesn't need you to advise. She really doesn't.
She knows.
And at the same time, I don't think doulas should feel afraid that they're outside their scope if the wrong thing pops out their mouth. If the wrong thing is popping out of their mouth, they should be going deep into, why am I doing this work?
Right.
If I want to substitute my judgment for anybody else's, or if I have such a strong opinion about what she should be doing, that's the reason not to do it.
Right.
Not because, you know, like if she's asking you for this, that the response shouldn't be, I'm so sorry, Hermina's out of my scope. The response should be, girl, I can't tell you what I think you should do. I could only tell you what I would do and why. And then I can talk with you about what you want to do. You know, and I'm willing to sit here with you all night.
Yeah.
We'll get to this.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the reason you hired me and the only reason I do this work is to support you in making your best decision, which might not be mine. And if I tell you what I think, then that might create some dynamic where you feel uncomfortable to do something different. You know what I mean? And I wouldn't want that.
Yeah.
So, so I guess in that sense, it's doulas should check themselves. But again, back to anytime women are talking to each other about sex and reproduction, and I say women in this sense because there is a gendering around speech around sex and who is allowed to talk about it. And women have been told for centuries, I mean, it was a huge part of the European witch hunts that talking about sexuality was that women sharing information about contraception, abortion, and other aspects of sexuality was like evidence of witchcraft and like punishable by death for centuries. So anytime you're in a space where women are being told or are telling each other that they must be silent and not speak about some aspect of sex or reproduction, like all of our hackles should go up, and we should say, somebody's telling us that we need to be silent. What's up here? What's really going on here?
Yeah.